The day I received the hospital discharge papers, I knew I was on my own. Not because they said so directly. My family was never that straightforward. It was the silence when the doctor asked who would be helping with my recovery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The way my mother suddenly found the wall calendar fascinating. The slight shift in my father's posture, angling away from my hospital bed-like proximity, might make him responsible. My brother Ryan's eyes, glued to his phone, thumbs typing messages, to people who weren't in this sterile room with its beeping monitors and hanging uncertainty. "I've got it covered," I said, signing the forms with my non-dominant hand, the only one that still worked properly. The physical therapist had concerns written all over her face, but I smiled through gritted teeth. "Really, it's all arranged." Nothing was arranged. Nothing except the slow, dawning realization that the family who had controlled every aspect of my life for 28 years had decided that a daughter in a neck brace with metal pins in her leg was too inconvenient for the Morgan family image. My name is Emma Morgan, and from wherever you're watching this video, stay with me. Because this isn't just a story about being abandoned when I needed support the most. It's about what happens when you finally realize your worth isn't measured by people who never truly saw you in the first place. The accident wasn't even my fault. I was driving home from my job at the architectural firm in downtown Boston, where I'd recently been promoted to junior partner. It was raining, that miserable October drizzle that makes taillights blur and everything feel gray. The truck driver later admitted he never saw the red light, too busy checking his delivery schedule. I saw headlights, felt the impact, heard glass shatter, and then nothing until I woke up with tubes in my arm and my mother sitting primly beside my bed, already talking about how this would affect the charity gala she was chairing the following month. "Such unfortunate timing," she said, not to me, but to my father, who stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear. "The Andersons already confirmed their table. We can't possibly cancel." I drifted in and out of consciousness during those first days, piecing together conversations never meant for me to hear. "The doctors said recovery could take a year." My father's voice, tight with irritation. "What about her job? Surely they have some responsibility here." My mother, already looking for someone else to shoulder the burden. "I've spoken with Martin at the firm. They'll hold her position for 3 months, but after that..." A pause. "They need someone in that role." "Well, she can stay at Pine Lake until she's back on her feet. The guest house is just sitting there anyway." Pine Lake, our family's cottage on the outskirts of the Berkshires. A sprawling 6-bedroom second home where we spent summers pretending to be close-knit while my parents networked with other wealthy families, and my brother and I were paraded out for dinner parties like perfectly groomed accessories. What they didn't discuss, what they never actually asked me, was what I wanted, what I needed, how I felt about being shipped off to a remote location while still learning to walk again, how I would manage alone in a house with 3 sets of stairs and no nearby services, how I would afford to live without income when my savings were already stretched thin from buying my downtown apartment, a purchase my father had called financially irresponsible, despite the fact that I'd saved for years. The Morgan family operated on unspoken rules and expectations. Rule number 1: appearances matter more than anything. Rule number 2: problems are to be hidden, not solved. Rule number 3: independence is encouraged only when convenient, for everyone else. For years, I'd contorted myself to fit these rules. Majored in business before switching to architecture when they weren't looking. Dated the right kind of men from the right kind of families, even when their hands wandered and their eyes glazed over when I spoke about my passions. Showed up at every family function with perfect hair and the right clothes, and just enough accomplishments to reflect well on the family name without threatening my brother's position as the golden child. Ryan had always been the favorite. 5 years older, Harvard Business School graduate, working at our father's investment firm, married to Elizabeth from the Good Williams family with their 2 perfect children and house in Beacon Hill. He was living the blueprint of success as defined by our parents, while I had always been the almost right, the not quite perfect, the Emma has so much potential if only she would apply herself properly. The day they discharged me from the hospital, Ryan drove me to my apartment in silence. When we arrived, he finally spoke. "Mom and Dad think it's best if you pack some things now. I'll drive you to Pine Lake tomorrow." I looked at him, this stranger who shared my blood. "And what do you think, Ryan?" He shifted, uncomfortable with direct questions that might require genuine emotion. "I think it's the most practical solution." "Practical," I repeated, tasting the word. It was so perfectly on brand for my family. Emotional distance wrapped in logical-sounding language. Elizabeth and I would offer our guest room, but with the kids and her mother visiting next month. He trailed off, not even bothering to complete the excuse. I nodded slowly, pain medication making everything slightly hazy around the edges. "I see." And for the first time, I truly did see. With perfect, crystalline clarity. I saw the pattern that had defined my entire life, being accommodated only when convenient, valued only when useful, loved only when undemanding. I saw how I'd been measuring my worth through their conditional approval for 28 years. I saw how the accident hadn't changed their behavior. It had merely stripped away my ability to pretend it was normal. "I'll need a few days to arrange things," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Ryan frowned. "Mom's already called Pine Lake. Mrs. Winters is opening the guest house tomorrow." Mrs. Winters, our long-suffering housekeeper who managed the property, year-round, another person whose convenience wasn't considered. I said I need a few days. Something in my tone must have registered because Ryan stepped back slightly. "Fine, I'll tell them you'll be ready by Friday." After he left, I sat in my silent apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built, the architectural drawings pinned to my walls, the mismatched furniture I'd lovingly collected from vintage shops, the plants thriving on my windowsill. All the small rebellions and personal touches I'd managed to carve out despite my family's expectations. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and called the one person who had never tried to reshape me. "Lauren, it's Emma. I need help." Lauren Chen had been my roommate in college, the first person who ever saw me clearly. She now ran a successful legal practice specializing in estate law and family disputes. She was at my apartment within the hour, takeout containers in hand, and fire in her eyes after I explained the situation. "They're just shipping you off? After major surgery? Without even asking what you want?" Her outrage was validating in ways I couldn't articulate. "They've done the calculations," I said, attempting humor. "I'm a liability, not an asset at the moment." Lauren wasn't smiling. "Emma, this isn't normal. This isn't how families are supposed to treat each other." I'd known this intellectually for years, had seen how Lauren's parents called her daily, just to check in, how they celebrated her accomplishments without qualification. Had observed other families where love didn't feel like a transaction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, but hearing it stated so plainly cracked something open inside me. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked around my apartment at the life I'd built despite them, and made a decision that would change everything. "I'm leaving," I said, softly. "Not to Pine Lake, just leaving." The look in Lauren's eyes wasn't pity or concern. It was recognition of the strength she'd always seen in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. "Tell me what you need," she said. What I needed, it turned out, was a plan. Not their plan for me, but my own. For the next 2 days, while Ryan texted increasingly irritated messages about when he should pick me up for Pine Lake, Lauren and I worked methodically. We contacted my employer and arranged for short-term disability payments. We found a sublet for my apartment that would cover most of my mortgage. We researched rehabilitation facilities covered by my insurance. And we began building the legal case that would eventually land on my parents' perfectly organized desk 3 months later. I didn't tell my family I was leaving, didn't leave a dramatic note or make tearful accusations. When Friday came, I simply wasn't there when Ryan arrived with his SUV and his impatience. My apartment looked untouched, as if I might have stepped out for coffee. My phone went to voicemail. By the time they realized I was truly gone, I was already settled into a rehabilitation center in Portland, Oregon, a continent away from their influence. The first week was the hardest, not physically, though the pain was constant and the rehabilitation exhausting, but emotionally. I kept expecting to crack, to call them in a moment of weakness, to apologize for the inconvenience of my independence. The decades of conditioning ran deep. Every time the phone rang with an unknown number, my heart raced with the possibility it might be them, that they might actually be worried enough to try finding me. But the calls were never from my family. Instead, they hired a private investigator, not out of concern, but out of outrage that I had disrupted their plans. I discovered this from my doorman in Boston, who called to let me know someone had been asking questions, showing my picture around. The PI had claimed to be a concerned family member, but his methods were those of someone tracking a fugitive, not checking on a loved one's welfare. That was when I knew I had made the right choice. They weren't looking for me because they cared. They were looking for me because I had, for the first time, refused to play my assigned role. The rehabilitation center became my sanctuary. My roommate was Delia, a former marathon runner recovering from a stroke at 34. She had no filter and abundant courage, pushing me when I needed pushing and sitting quietly with me when I needed silence. The physical therapists were demanding but kind. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who expected me to succeed, but didn't attach their approval to that success. "Your leg is not cooperating today, Marcos," my PT would say with a grin. "That's okay. Neither is my coffee maker. We adapt." Such a simple statement, but revolutionary to someone who had grown up believing that imperfection was unacceptable. I improved faster than the doctors predicted. Not because I was trying to prove anything to my family, but because I was finally healing in an environment free from their judgment. Each small victory belonged to me alone. Each setback was just that, a temporary challenge, not a character flaw. Lauren visited twice, bringing updates from Boston, and more importantly, updates on the legal strategy we were building. Because while I was healing my body, I was also preparing to address the deeper wounds. "They liquidated your trust fund," she told me during her second visit, tablet in hand with the evidence. "Your father moved it all 2 weeks after you disappeared." I had expected this. The trust fund, set up by my grandparents when I was born, was substantial, but had always been dangled like a reward for compliance. What I hadn't expected was how little it hurt to lose it. "Can they do that legally?" I asked. Lauren's smile was not kind. "No, the terms were explicit. The fund becomes fully yours at 30, or in case of medical emergency. Your accident qualifies on the second count, and they know it. They're counting on you not fighting back." "They don't know me." "Very well then," I said, realizing as the words left my mouth how true they were. My family had never really known me at all. They had known their projection of me, the daughter they thought they had, not the woman I actually was. By month 3, I was walking with only a slight limp. The neck brace was gone. I had found a small apartment in Portland and lined up remote, work with a sustainable architecture firm based in Seattle. I was building a life by design rather than by default. The pieces were falling into place. And it was time to address the last piece. the family that had discarded me when I became inconvenient. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Lauren asked. Over video chat, legal documents spread before her. "We can wait until you're completely recovered." I shook my head. "I'm not interested in revenge, Lauren. I just want what's legally mine so I can close this chapter completely." What was legally mine included the trust fund, yes. But it also included my grandparents' collection of architectural drawings that my father had borrowed for his office. My portion of a family inheritance that had been invested on my behalf, but never accounted for. And most importantly, my ownership stake in the family's historical property in Newport, not Pine Lake, which I wanted no part of, but the original, Morgan home where my grandfather had taught me to draw while my parents were busy networking. Lauren drafted the letter herself, clinical and precise. No emotional appeals, no accusations, just facts, figures, legal precedents, and a clear deadline for response. It was delivered by courier to my parents' Beacon Hill home, timed to arrive, during their monthly family dinner, the one I had never been allowed to miss before. I could picture the scene perfectly, the formal dining room with its Federalist furniture and uncomfortable chairs. My mother at one end, my father at the other. Ryan and Elizabeth and their perfect children dressed in coordinating outfits. The moment the letter arrived, disrupting their carefully orchestrated evening. I didn't need to be there to know exactly how they would react. My mother would dismiss it initially, assuming it was a mistake or a prank. My father would read it with growing indignation, face flushing with the outrage of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. Ryan would immediately start calculating how it might affect his position at the firm, his inheritance, his standing. They would close ranks, as the Morgans always did when threatened. What they wouldn't do, what they had proven themselves incapable of doing, was reflect on how their actions had contributed to this moment. I didn't expect an immediate response, and I didn't get one. What I got instead was a series of increasingly desperate maneuvers. They tried to freeze my remaining accounts. They called my former employer. They even reached out to my college friends, the few they had bothered to remember, looking for leverage. When none of that worked, Ryan finally called. I let it go. To voicemail, not ready to hear his voice. "Emma, this is ridiculous," his message began. No greeting, no inquiry about my health. "Dad is furious. You need to call off your attack dog of a lawyer and come home so we can discuss this like adults." Like adults. As if their decision to abandon me after my accident had been the adult choice. As if my independence was the childish act. I didn't. Call back. 3 days later, my mother tried. Her message was more subtle but no less manipulative. "Emma, darling, we've been so worried. This misunderstanding has gone on long enough. I'm sure we can work things out without involving strangers in family business." Strangers. That's how they saw Lauren, as an intruder rather than the person who had actually supported me when they wouldn't. The irony wasn't lost on me. Finally, as our deadline approached, my father's attorney called Lauren directly. They wanted to negotiate, behind closed doors, without formal filings that might become public record. In other words, they wanted to maintain appearances, the first rule of the Morgan family playbook. Lauren and I had anticipated this. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "We have a strong case if you want to push forward with court proceedings." I considered the question carefully. What did I want? Not revenge, not to hurt them as they had hurt me, but also not to be manipulated. Back into the role I had spent my life playing. "Tell them I'll meet with them," I said finally. But on my terms, not theirs. My terms were simple: a neutral location, Lauren present as my representative, and complete financial transparency. Before the meeting, if they wanted to avoid court, they would need to provide full documentation of all accounts, properties, and holdings connected to my name or my grandparents' intentions. I expected resistance. Instead, They agreed immediately, a sign of just how concerned they were about potential public exposure. The meeting was set for exactly 3 months and 2 days after I had left Boston. The location: a conference room in a downtown Portland law office. I would not be returning to Boston, would not be stepping back onto their territory where old patterns might resurface. If they wanted to resolve this, they would need to come to me. The night before the meeting, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, studying my reflection. The physical changes were evident. The slight scar along my jawline, the way I still leaned a bit to compensate for my healing leg. But the most significant changes weren't visible. They were in the way I held myself, the way I no longer flinched at potential disapproval, the way I recognized my own worth without needing external validation. I wasn't just healing from the accident. I was recovering from a lifetime of conditional love. When I walked into that conference room the next morning, Lauren at my side, I was ready. Not armored, not braced for battle, but calmly certain of my position. My father sat stiffly in an expensive suit, my mother beside him with perfect posture and a frozen smile. Ryan had not made the trip, a telling absence. "Emma?" my mother said, voice carefully modulated to show just the right amount of concern. "You look..." Well, she seemed genuinely surprised, as if she had expected me to fall apart without their guidance. As if the accident and their abandonment should have diminished me rather than revealing my strength. "I am well," I said simply. My father cleared his throat. "This has gone on long enough. We're prepared to reinstate your trust fund if you'll drop this nonsense and come home." Home, as if the word still held meaning between us. Lauren opened her folder, spreadsheets and documents neatly, organized. "Before we discuss any resolution, we'll need confirmation that the documentation provided is complete and accurate." What followed was 3 hours of meticulous financial examination. Every attempt at emotional manipulation was met with Lauren's calm request to focus on the matter at hand. Every suggestion that I was being ungrateful or dramatic was redirected to specific legal questions. By hour 2, my father's frustration was palpable. He was not accustomed to being the one without power in the room. "What do you want from us, Emma?" he finally demanded. "You've disrupted our entire family over what? Because we suggested you recover at Pine Lake instead of alone in your apartment." I met his gaze steadily. "You didn't suggest anything. You decided, without consulting me, that my life could be packed up and rearranged for your convenience. When I was at my most vulnerable, you saw me as a problem to solve, not a daughter to support. That's not..." "It is," I interrupted, something I had never done before. "And it wasn't just the accident. It was my entire life. You have never seen me clearly, never valued me for who I am, rather than how I reflect on you. I spent 28 years trying to earn the unconditional love that should have been my birthright." The silence that followed was heavy with decades of unspoken truths. "We've always done what we thought was best for you," my mother finally said, her voice small. "No," I replied gently. "You've done what was best for the Morgan family image. There's a difference." In the end, we reached an agreement. I would receive my full trust fund with interest. The architectural drawings would be returned. My stake in the Newport property would be bought out at market value. In exchange, I would sign a confidentiality agreement about the financial details, protecting their precious reputation. What I didn't sign away was my right to my own story, my right to speak about how they had treated me, what I had learned, how I had rebuilt myself away from their influence. As we concluded the meeting, my father stood awkwardly, briefcase in, and, "Will you be coming home now? Your mother has kept your room." I shook my head. "This is my home now. I'm building my life here." "But you're a Morgan," he said, as if the name alone should pull me back into orbit around them. I smiled, feeling a wave of unexpected compassion for this man who could only understand identity through legacy and appearances. "I am Emma," I said, "and that's enough." We didn't hug goodbye, didn't make promises to stay in touch. Some relationships can't be rehabilitated, and I had made peace with that. As they left the conference room, my mother turned back once, her expression unreadable. I lifted my hand in a small wave, not an invitation, but an acknowledgement of the chapter closing between us. Later that evening, as I sat on the small balcony of my Portland apartment, watching the sunset over a city I was growing to love, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's Ryan. I should have done better. I'm sorry." 10 words. Not enough to heal everything, but perhaps enough to acknowledge that something had been broken. I didn't respond immediately. Forgiveness, like recovery, couldn't be rushed. Instead, I set the phone aside and watched as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. In the growing darkness, the city lights flickered on one by one, each a tiny beacon in the night. Like stars you could reach out and touch, like possibilities waiting to be claimed. I had lost a family but found myself in the process, and as I sat there, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in years, I realized that was more than a fair exchange. My name is Emma Morgan. This is my story. And for the first time in my life, I'm the one telling it. Growing up in the Morgan household meant learning to translate silence. My parents didn't communicate in raised voices or slammed doors. Their disappointment came in the form of extended pauses, tightened smiles, and conversations that happened about me rather than with me. I became fluent in this language of absence. Early could read volumes in the space between my father's rigid shoulders and my mother's pointed sighs. Our family home in Beacon Hill wasn't just a house. It was a carefully cultivated statement. 5 stories of impeccable brick and gleaming windows, interior designed by someone whose name my mother dropped at every opportunity. Charlotte Hamilton. Did the entire East Wing, she would tell visitors, as if rooms needed geographical designations in a private residence. Every surface was chosen to communicate something specific about who we were, or rather, who my parents wanted others to believe we were. Wealthy, but tastefully so. Traditional, but with just enough modern touches to avoid seeming stuffy. Perfect, in a way that made visitors simultaneously impressed and uncomfortable. I learned to navigate this perfection like a minefield, careful not to disturb the delicate artifacts of our family mythology. By age 7, I knew which topics were acceptable at dinner: Ryan's academic achievements, my father's latest business acquisition, the right kind of current events, and which would cause my mother's mouth to tighten into that particular smile that wasn't a smile at all. My excessive reading habits, questions about family members who had fallen from grace, anything that might suggest the Morgans were less than exceptional. My brother Ryan adapted to these unwritten rules effortlessly. 5 years my senior, he seemed born understanding what our parents wanted. He played the right sports, befriended the right children, excelled in the right subjects. When he spoke, my parents leaned forward slightly, as if his words carried more weight than the ambient air. When I spoke, they often continued whatever they were doing, reading the newspaper, checking emails, mentally cataloging the neighbor's landscaping failures. "Emma has such an imagination," my mother would say whenever I expressed an opinion that diverged from the approved Morgan narrative. Not a compliment, but a gentle correction. Imagination was tolerated in carefully controlled doses, enough to seem well-rounded, not enough to become inconvenient. The first time I mentioned wanting to be an architect, I was 12. We were at one of my father's interminable corporate dinners, seated with the Prentice family, whose son Jason was being groomed to take over their development company. The conversation had turned to a new building downtown, its controversial design dominating the skyline. "It's destroying the character of the neighborhood," Mrs. Prentice declared, cutting her salmon with surgical precision. I had spent weeks reading about the building, fascinated by how the architect had incorporated elements of the surrounding historical structures while creating something boldly contemporary. Actually, I said, forgetting myself for a moment, if you look at the base of the building, it mirrors the proportions of the original 1890s facades on that block. The architect was trying to create a dialogue between— My father cleared his throat, the sound like a door closing. Emma's recently developed an interest in buildings, he said, his tone making it clear this was a passing phase, like my earlier obsession with horses or my brief attempt at learning violin. I want to be an architect someday, I continued, not recognizing the warning. My mother laughed, the sound like ice cubes in crystal. Darling, you said you wanted to be a veterinarian last month. The Prentices smiled indulgently. Jason snickered behind his water glass. Later that night, as our driver took us home, my father turned to me with rare directness. The architectural profession is extremely competitive, Emma, and not particularly suitable for someone of your temperament. What temperament? I asked. You're sensitive, my mother interjected from beside him. Creative types struggle in business settings, and architecture is as much business as art. I wanted to argue, to explain that I had been researching architectural programs, that I had read biographies of famous architects, that I spent hours sketching buildings and floor plans. Instead, I looked out the window at Boston sliding past, the city I thought I knew revealing itself as a place where people like me were expected to admire buildings, not design them. Despite this discouragement, my interest in architecture didn't fade. I just learned to pursue it more quietly, collecting books that I kept in a storage container under my bed, sketching in notebooks I never left lying around. When it came time for college applications, I didn't even attempt to argue for an architecture program. I applied to business schools as expected, with the secret plan to switch majors once I had some distance from home. Northeastern University wasn't my parents' first choice. They had envisioned Harvard or at least Boston College, but they accepted it as adequately prestigious. What they didn't know was that I had selected it specifically for its strong architecture program and flexible major switching policies. My freshman year roommate, Lauren Chen, was the first person who ever asked me what I wanted rather than telling me what I should want. She arrived at our dorm room with a suitcase in each hand and direct eyes that seemed to see right through the careful facade I had constructed. So, she said after we'd exchanged awkward introductions, what? Are you really interested in beyond what your application says? I stared at her, momentarily speechless. No one had ever asked me that question before. Architecture, I said finally, the word feeling dangerous and thrilling as it left my mouth. I want to design buildings that change how people experience space. Lauren nodded, not a trace of judgment or disbelief in her expression. Cool. My cousin's an architect in Chicago. She says it's brutal but worth it. Just like that, acknowledgement without evaluation. No weighing of whether I was suited for it, whether it was practical, whether it aligned with some predetermined identity. Just acceptance of my interest as something valid on its own terms. Over the next few weeks, Lauren became the first real friend I'd ever had. Not someone selected for strategic social advancement, not a carefully vetted daughter of my parents' associates, but a person who saw me clearly and liked what she saw anyway. She was studying pre-law, unapologetically ambitious in a way I found both intimidating and inspiring. Your parents don't know you're planning to switch majors, do they? She asked one night as we studied in our room, connecting dots I hadn't realized were so visible. I shook my head. They'd cut me off financially. Would they really? Or is that what you're afraid might happen? The question hit something tender inside me. I don't actually know, I admitted. We don't discuss things directly in my family. Lauren considered this. That sounds exhausting. It was exhausting. The constant vigilance, the careful management of my true self, the emotional translation required for every interaction. I had never recognized how much energy it consumed until someone named it. 2 months into freshman year, I submitted my paperwork to transfer to the architecture program. 2 weeks after that, I received my acceptance. The same day, my father called. "Your academic advisor contacted us," he said without preamble. "Something about a major change." My stomach dropped. I hadn't anticipated this breach of what I'd thought was confidential information. Later, I would learn that my father had specifically requested to be notified of any significant academic changes, and that the university had complied out of respect for his substantial donations to the business school. "I was going to tell you," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I had planned to tell them, after it was too late to reverse course. "We're coming to Boston tomorrow," he replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Your mother and I need to discuss this. With you in person." The meeting happened at an upscale restaurant where private conversations were masked by the gentle clinking of expensive silverware and the discreet distance between tables. My father ordered for all of us without consulting the menu or our preferences, a power move so habitual he probably didn't even recognize it as such. "Architecture," my mother said once the waiter had retreated, the word sounding foreign and slightly distasteful in her mouth. "Emma, be reasonable. The statistics on women in that field are abysmal." "That's changing," I countered, having researched this exact argument. "And some of the most innovative firms are actively recruiting women designers. Innovation is fine for people who can afford to take risks," my father said. "The Morgans built their success on reliability, not flights of fancy." "I'm not having a flight of fancy. I've wanted this since I was 12. My mother sighed, placing her napkin in her lap with precise movements. "Darling, you've always been impressionable. Remember your photography phase? Or when you wanted to learn Japanese because of that animated film?" Each example carefully selected to minimize, to infantilize, to rewrite my consistent interest in architecture as just another passing whim. I looked at these two people who had raised me and realized with startling clarity that they had never actually seen me. "This isn't a phase," I said quietly. "This is what I want to do with my life." My father's expression hardened. "What you want is irrelevant if it's impractical. The business degree we're funding will open doors at firms where you'll have actual opportunities for advancement. I don't want those opportunities. I want to design buildings." "Then you can design them as a hobby," my mother interjected smoothly. "After you've established yourself in a proper career." The conversation continued in this vein, each of us repeating variations of the same points without truly engaging with what the others were saying. When the check came, my father signed it with a flourish and delivered his final verdict. "You have until the end of the semester to transfer back to the business program, if you choose to continue with this. Diversion, you'll do so without our financial support." It wasn't an empty threat. The Morgans didn't make those. When they set consequences, they followed through with ruthless efficiency. I returned to my dorm room that night and found Lauren at her desk, surrounded by textbooks. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. "That bad, huh?" she asked. I nodded, collapsing onto my bed. "They're cutting me off if I don't switch back." Lauren closed her book. "What are you going to do?" It was the second time she had asked me what I wanted, rather than telling me what I should do. The novelty hadn't worn off. "I don't know," I admitted. "I can't afford tuition on my own, even with scholarships, but I can't go back to business. I just can't." "Then we'll figure it out," she said, as if complex problems had simple solutions when approached with sufficient determination. My roommate is stubborn enough to defy her controlling dynasty family. She's definitely stubborn enough to find a way to pay for college. My roommate. Not the Morgan girl or the problem child or the disappointment. Just her roommate, defined by our relationship rather than my family or my potential utility. That night marked the beginning of my real education, not in architecture, but in self-determination. Over the next week, Lauren and I researched scholarship options, work-study programs, private loans. I met with financial aid counselors who looked doubtful but provided information. I calculated budgets, living expenses, potential part-time jobs. The numbers didn't quite add up. Even with maximum financial aid, I would still fall short each semester. The gap wasn't insurmountable, but it was significant enough to make me question if I was being foolish, if perhaps my parents were right about the impracticality of my choice. What if they're right? I asked Lauren late one night as we pored over yet another scholarship application. What if I'm not cut out for this? Maybe they are right, she said, surprising me. Maybe you'll fail spectacularly, but at least it will be your failure, not the life they programmed for you. My failure. The concept was revolutionary. In the Morgan household, failure wasn't an option because failure reflected poorly on the family. But Lauren was suggesting that failing at something I chose might be more valuable than succeeding at something chosen for me. The next morning, I called my grandfather, my mother's father, retired from his own successful architectural practice, in Newport. We had always shared a quiet bond, though our interactions were carefully monitored and limited by my parents who found his artistic temperament somewhat embarrassing. "Grandpa, it's Emma," I said when he answered. "Well, this is an unexpected pleasure," he replied, his voice warm through the phone line. "To what do I owe the honor?" I explained the situation, my decision to pursue architecture, my parents' ultimatum, my financial dilemma. As I spoke, I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for him to side with them, to tell me to be sensible, to prioritize security over passion. Instead, he laughed. "Your mother never told you, did she?" "Told? Me what?" "I set up a trust for you when you were born, for your education, specifically. It wasn't much then, but it's grown nicely over the years. More than enough to cover your degree, with some left over to get you started afterward." I sat down, legs suddenly unsteady. "Why didn't I know about this?" "Your parents preferred to handle your education themselves. Control of the purse strings means control of the choices, you see. But the trust becomes yours at 21, regardless of their wishes. That's only, what, 3 years from now?" 2.5, I said automatically. "Well then, you'll need to find a way to bridge that gap, but afterward you'll be free to pursue architecture without their financial leverage." The revelation was dizzying. Not just the existence of the trust, but the fact that my grandfather had anticipated this very scenario, had created a safeguard against the control my parents so carefully maintained. "They'll be furious," I said, already imagining the glacial silence, the tight smiles, the conversations about me that would happen around me. "Undoubtedly," he agreed, sounding untroubled by the prospect. "But you know what I've learned in my 78 years, Emma? People who use money to control others are counting on fear to maintain that control. Once you stop being afraid, they lose their power. Stop being afraid." 3 simple words that represented a fundamental shift in how I viewed my relationship with my family. Over the next few weeks, I constructed a plan as meticulously as I might design a building. I applied for every scholarship I qualified for, secured a work-study position in the architecture department, found a cheaper off-campus apartment with 3 roommates that would significantly reduce my living expenses. I calculated exactly how much I would need to borrow to cover the gap until my trust became accessible. The numbers finally balanced, precariously, but definitely. I could do this without my parents' support. It would be difficult, but not impossible. When I called to inform them of my decision, my mother answered. I could hear classical music playing in the background. Vivaldi, her preferred composer for Sunday afternoons. I'm staying in the architecture program, I said without preamble, recognizing that pleasantries would only delay the inevitable conflict. The music stopped abruptly. You understand what that means, she replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. I do. I've made arrangements for my tuition and expenses. A pause, longer than usual, filled with recalculation. What? Arrangements? I didn't mention the trust. No need to play that card yet. Scholarships, work study, student loans. Another pause, this one tinged with something like uncertainty. The Morgan family did not take loans. Debt was for people without resources or responsibility. Your father will be very disappointed, she said finally. Not, we will be disappointed. Not, I'm concerned for your future. Just a statement about how my father would feel, as if his disappointment was the most significant consequence I should consider. I know, I replied, but this is my decision to make. We've only ever wanted what's best for you, she said, the familiar refrain carrying less weight than it once had. I know you believe that, I answered carefully, but I need to figure out what's best for me on my own terms. The conversation ended shortly after, no resolution reached, just a stalemate. Acknowledged. True to their word, my parents withdrew their financial support completely. My tuition payment for the next semester vanished from the system. My supplemental meal plan disappeared. The credit card they had provided for emergencies was canceled, without notice. What they didn't expect was that I had already planned for each of these contingencies. I had applied for emergency aid through the university. I had secured a weekend job at a local cafe to cover food expenses. I had opened my own credit card with a small limit for genuine emergencies. Their leverage, so carefully maintained throughout. My life had evaporated not because I had equal resources, but because I was no longer afraid of their disapproval. The next 3 years were challenging in ways I couldn't have fully anticipated. I worked longer hours than most of my classmates, took heavier course loads to graduate on time, learned to survive on amounts of sleep that seemed medically inadvisable. There were nights I questioned my choice, mornings I woke up exhausted and envious of peers whose parents still provided safety nets. But there were other moments, standing in the architecture studio at 3 a.m., watching my first major design come together under the glow of drafting lights, presenting a project to visiting professionals who asked for my contact information afterward, seeing my name on the dean's list despite working 20 hours a week alongside a full course load. These moments sustained me, confirmed that the difficult path was nonetheless the right one. Lauren remained my steadfast supporter, even as she conquered her own challenging pre-law curriculum. We moved off campus together after freshman year, sharing a cramped apartment with 2 other students to save on rent. My relationship with my parents entered a strange limbo during this period. We didn't cut contact entirely, but our interactions became formal, infrequent, and carefully circumscribed. I went home for major holidays, where my academic and career choices were pointedly not discussed. My mother asked about friends, but never about classes. My father inquired about my part-time jobs, but never about my design projects. Ryan, ever the perfect son, attempted awkward mediation during these tense family gatherings. They'll come around, he would tell me in private moments, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Just give them time to adjust to the idea. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I was no longer waiting for their approval. Their adjustment to my choices was their responsibility, not mine. When I turned 21, I met with the trustee of my grandfather's fund. The amount available was indeed sufficient to cover my remaining education costs and provide a modest nest egg for after graduation. I paid off my student loans immediately, the relief of freedom from debt almost dizzying. My parents' reaction to the trust was predictably cold. "Your grandfather always did have a flair for the dramatic," my mother commented when I mentioned receiving the funds. Though I'm sure he intended it as a supplement to our support, not a replacement. What went unspoken was their shock that I had managed without them, that their financial leverage had failed to bring me back into the approved Morgan Life plan. Whatever disappointment they felt was tempered by a new awareness that I was capable of independence they hadn't anticipated. By senior year, I had secured an internship at Hathaway Partners, a mid-sized architectural firm specializing in sustainable urban development. The position came with the possibility of full-time employment after graduation, depending on performance. I threw myself into the work, determined to prove my value beyond my academic credentials. 2 months before graduation, the firm offered me a junior position on their design team. The salary was modest by Morgan standards, but more than adequate for my needs. More importantly, it was a foot in the door of the profession I had fought so hard to enter. When I called to share the news with my parents, my father answered. Our conversations had thawed slightly over the previous year, though a certain formality remained. "Hathaway Partners," he repeated after I told him about the offer. "Thomas Hathaway's firm?" "Yes," I confirmed, surprised he recognized the name. "Do you know him?" A pause, the familiar sound of mental recalibration. "We've crossed paths at various functions. His firm does respectable work." Coming from my father, this was practically effusive praise. I waited for the qualifier, the subtle undermining that typically followed any acknowledgement of my achievements. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Your mother and I would like to host a small graduation dinner for you. At the house. Just family." The invitation was unexpected. Not because they would ignore my graduation, appearances mattered too much for that, but because of the specified location. The Morgan home, rather than a restaurant where potential awkwardness could be masked by public setting requirements. "I'll check my schedule," I said carefully, unwilling to commit immediately. "The end of semester is quite busy." "Of course," he replied, his tone neutral. "Let us know." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, turning the invitation over in my mind. Was it a genuine olive branch? A strategic move to reassert their relevance now that I had secured legitimate professional standing? Or simply the expected social obligation to acknowledge a significant milestone? Lauren, now in her first year of law school and still my closest friend, listened to my deliberations with her usual thoughtful attention. "You don't owe them your presence," she pointed out. "But avoiding them doesn't exactly scream I've moved beyond this either." She was right, as usual. True independence wasn't about cutting ties or holding grudges. It was about engaging with people, even difficult family members, on my own terms, without fear of their judgment or need for their approval. I decided to attend the dinner, not as the dutiful daughter seeking reconciliation, but as the independent adult I had become, capable of setting boundaries and maintaining them even in the charged atmosphere of my childhood home. The evening of my graduation dinner arrived with Boston in full spring bloom, magnolia trees lining Commonwealth Avenue in spectacular pink and white display. I took a car service to my parents' home, having sold my ancient Honda to cover expenses, during a particularly tight semester. As the car pulled up to the familiar brick facade, I felt a strange doubling of perception, seeing both the imposing family home of my childhood and simultaneously evaluating it with my newly trained architectural eye. The proportions I had once found intimidating now struck me as slightly ostentatious, the decorative elements more about projection than aesthetic harmony. Ryan opened the door before I could ring the bell, his smile genuine if somewhat nervous. "Em, you made it." He hugged me quickly, then stepped back to look me over. "You look different." I was wearing a simple black dress, professional but not formal, with the vintage silver earrings my grandfather had given me when I received my acceptance to the architecture program. My hair was shorter than when they'd last seen me, cut in, a practical bob that required minimal maintenance during busy workdays. "Different good or different concerning?" I asked, half joking. "Just different," he replied evasively, ushering me inside. Mom and Dad are in the living room. The house smelled exactly as I remembered: lemon polish, subtle floral arrangements, the faint cedar notes from my father's preferred whiskey. So familiar it was almost disorienting, as if the past 4 years of independence might evaporate in this carefully preserved environment. My parents rose as I entered the living room, their postures straight, expressions carefully calibrated to show appropriate parental pride without excessive emotion. My mother had arranged herself on the silk damask sofa, a strategic position that allowed her to observe everyone else while appearing perfectly at ease. "Emma," she said, extending her hand as if we were business associates rather than mother and daughter. "You look well." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the brief contact. "The apartment gets plenty of natural light, good for the complexion." A small reference to my independent living situation, a gentle reminder that I had created a life beyond their influence. My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. My father offered me a glass of champagne, an uncharacteristic gesture that signaled this was indeed meant to be a celebration of sorts. "To your graduation," he said, raising his own glass, "and your position at Hathaway Partners." We clinked. Glasses, the ritual feeling both foreign and familiar. For a moment, no one seemed to know what to say next. The weight of 4 years of minimal contact and unresolved tensions hovering in the space between us. Ryan, ever the diplomat, stepped into the silence. "Emma's been telling me about her first project at the firm. Something about revitalizing a former industrial space. A lifeline, offered with genuine goodwill." I took it, describing the abandoned warehouse my team was converting into mixed-use residential and commercial space. As I spoke, I found myself using the technical vocabulary of my profession without self-consciousness, explaining concepts like adaptive reuse and contextual integration, with the confidence of someone who belonged in the field. My father listened with unexpected attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed he had researched urban development trends. My mother remained more reserved, but I caught her studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Something between surprise and reluctant reassessment. Dinner proceeded with similar careful navigation, all of us stepping around the deeper issues while finding safe topics to discuss. Ryan talked about his recent promotion at our father's firm, his wife Elizabeth's pregnancy, their plans to renovate their Beacon Hill brownstone. It was only when dessert was served, my childhood favorite, creme brulee with fresh berries, that my mother finally broached the subject we had been avoiding. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, stirring her coffee with precise movements, "of your persistence." The word choice was telling, not achievement, not talent, but persistence. Still, coming from her, it was nearly a declaration of surrender. "Thank you," I said simply, deciding to accept the awkward olive branch rather than dissect its inadequacies. "I think he would be." My father cleared his throat. "We may have been hasty in our assessment of your career choice. Not an apology, not quite, but the closest approximation the Morgan family vocabulary allowed for." I nodded, acknowledging the concession without needing to magnify it. "Architecture suits me," I replied. "I'm glad I had the opportunity to discover that for myself." The remainder of the evening passed in similar careful exchanges. Not warm, not particularly emotionally satisfying, but marked by a new kind of mutual recognition. They had finally accepted that I would choose my own path. I had finally accepted that their approval, while occasionally nice to have, was not necessary for my happiness or success. As I prepared to leave, my father handed me an envelope. "A graduation gift," he said, his tone neutral. no strings attached. I accepted it without opening it, tucking it into my purse. Thank you for dinner, and for the gift. My mother hovered in the doorway, clearly uncertain about the appropriate farewell. I made the decision for her, stepping forward to offer a brief hug, not the desperate embrace of a daughter seeking approval, but the polite contact of an adult acknowledging a complex relationship. Congratulations again, she said as I pulled away. Your work sounds fulfilling. The highest praise she could offer for a career path she still didn't fully understand or endorse. It is, I confirmed. Extremely. The car was waiting. At the curb, ready to return me to my apartment, to my independent life built on my own terms. As we pulled away from the house, I finally opened the envelope my father had given me. Inside was a check, substantial but not excessive, and a brief note in his precise handwriting. For your future. However you choose to build it. Not a complete reconciliation, not an erasing of the past 4 years of struggle and distance, but perhaps a recognition, however belated, that my choices deserved respect, even when they diverged from the prescribed Morgan path. I folded the note carefully and returned it to the envelope, feeling neither triumphant nor vindicated, just quietly certain that I had found my way not despite their opposition, but because of it. Their attempt to control me had instead forced me to discover my own strength, to build a foundation of self-reliance that no external approval or disapproval could shake. As the car turned onto my street, I caught sight of my reflection in the me window, poised, confident, unburdened by the weight of expectations I hadn't chosen. The journey from the dutiful Morgan daughter to the woman I had become wasn't finished, might never be completely finished. But I was no longer walking a path designed by others. I was the architect of my own life, drawing the blueprints as I went, creating spaces defined by my own vision rather than anyone else's. And for now, that was enough. The email arrived at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the timestamp itself a red flag. Normal correspondence doesn't come in the middle of the night. Normal correspondence doesn't have a subject line that reads simply, "Documented sightings." I was working late on revisions for a client presentation, my apartment quiet except for the occasional car passing on the street below. Portland at night had become my favorite time to work. The world hushed, my thoughts clearer without daytime distractions. I almost ignored the message, assuming it was spam that had evaded filters. But something about the sender's address, a string of numbers and letters at a private domain, made me pause. I clicked it open, expecting marketing copy or a phishing attempt. Instead, I found 3 paragraphs of meticulous detail about my daily routines. My morning coffee stop at Fuller's on Northwest 13th. My physical therapy appointments at Rehab NW on Tuesdays and Fridays. The fact that I took lunch to Jameson Square on clear days, sitting on the east bench with my back to the fountain. The message wasn't threatening, not explicitly. It was observational, clinical almost. Like field notes about an animal's habitat, patterns. It ended with a single line. Your parents are concerned about your continued silence. Standard rates apply for ongoing surveillance. I read it 3 times, my hands growing colder with each pass. The message wasn't from my parents. It was from someone they had hired. Someone who had been watching me, cataloging my movements, compiling a dossier on my new life 3,000 miles from Boston. Someone who was now, apparently, trying to leverage that information for additional payment, either from my parents or from me. My first instinct was to close my laptop, pull the curtains, check the locks on my doors and windows. My second, more rational thought was to call Lauren. But it was after 5 a.m. in New York, where she was clerking for a federal judge. Even our friendship had boundaries, and middle-of-the-night panic wasn't something I was willing to impose on her. Instead, I forwarded the email to my secure cloud storage, took screenshots, then deleted it from my inbox. Not out of fear, but strategy. I needed time to think, to plan my response carefully. If my parents had indeed hired someone to monitor me, it represented an escalation I hadn't anticipated. In the 8 months since my discharge from the hospital, since their effective abandonment when I needed them most, there had been only silence from Boston. No calls, no messages, no inquiries about my recovery through mutual contacts. I had assumed they were doing what the Morgans always did with inconvenient situations, pretending they didn't exist until they could be reframed into something more palatable for the family narrative. Emma had an accident, yes, but she's taking some time at our property in the Berkshires to recuperate. So thoughtful of her to remove herself from the public eye during this difficult time. But surveillance suggested something else entirely. Not indifference, but obsession. Not abandonment, but a twisted form of control. They couldn't help me, couldn't acknowledge my needs or my independence, but they could still monitor me like a wayward investment that might yield returns if properly tracked. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I did what architects do best. I analyzed the structure of the problem, identified weak points, and began designing solutions. The first question was verification. Was the email legitimate or an elaborate hoax? The details were specific enough to be concerning, but Portland wasn't Boston. People were friendlier here, more observant. My routines weren't exactly secretive. Anyone who frequented the same coffee shop or worked near my physical therapy center might notice patterns. The second question was motive. If my parents had hired surveillance, what were they hoping to discover? That I was struggling? Succeeding? Had they expected me to crawl back to Boston once my savings ran out and were now puzzled by my continued independence? The third question, and perhaps the most important, what did I want to do about it? By morning, I had a plan, not complete, but with enough structure to begin. First, I would confirm whether I was actually being watched. Then, if confirmed, I would decide whether to confront, evade, or simply acknowledge the surveillance. Each option had advantages and risks, and I needed more information before making that choice. I called in sick to work for the first time since starting at Westridge Design Group 3 months earlier. My supervisor, Elaine, was understanding. "Take care of yourself, Emma. The Henderson revisions can wait until tomorrow." Then I did something completely out of character. I went shopping. Not at my usual places, the consignment shops on Hawthorne, or the minimalist boutiques in the Pearl District, but at a sprawling department store in the suburbs. I purchased items I would never normally buy. A bright red raincoat when my aesthetic was firmly in the neutral palette, platform sandals when I typically wore practical flats, bold patterned dresses that didn't remotely resemble my usual architectural silhouettes. In the store's restroom, I changed completely. New clothes, hair pulled up under a wide-brimmed hat, sunglasses larger than my usual style. Not a disguise exactly, but a significant deviation from the Emma Morgan who might be described in a surveillance report. Then I took public transportation, another departure from my routine, to the Central Library downtown. From a public computer, I searched for information on private investigators in Portland, focusing on those with East Coast connections or specializing in family matters. I made a list of the most promising candidates, noting their office locations and business hours. Next, I visited a small electronics shop run by a former security specialist. The owner, a gray-haired woman named Vivian with tattoos covering both arms, listened to my carefully edited story about concerns regarding my apartment's security. "Ex-boyfriend problems?" she asked bluntly. "Family complications," I replied, matching her directness. She nodded, requiring no further explanation. Cameras are obvious if you know what to look for. The real concern is digital monitoring. Phone, computer, car, if it's newer than 2018. For the next hour, Vivian walked me through basic counter-surveillance measures. Some were simple, changing passwords, enabling two-factor authentication, checking my devices for unfamiliar applications. Others were more involved, including purchasing a basic RF detector to identify potential listening devices and a Faraday bag for my phone when I needed absolute privacy. Most PI work is digital now, she explained as I paid for my purchases. Physical surveillance is expensive and easily detected. If someone's watching you, they're probably using a combination of digital tracking and occasional in-person confirmation. How would I know if someone was physically following me? I asked. Vivian's expression softened slightly. The same person or vehicle appearing in different locations throughout your day, someone who seems to be taking excessive interest in mundane activities. Trust your instincts. Humans are predators by evolution. We're wired to notice when we're being hunted. Hunted. The word settled uncomfortably in my chest. Was that what was happening? Was I prey in some bizarre game my parents had initiated? I spent the remainder of the day implementing Vivian's recommendations, working methodically through security measures for my digital life. By evening, I felt more secure, but no less unsettled. The possibility of surveillance had transformed Portland, my sanctuary, my chosen home, into potentially hostile territory. The next morning, I returned to my normal routine with one significant difference: absolute awareness of my surroundings. I noticed things I had previously overlooked. The man who always seemed to be reading a newspaper in the cafe where I got my morning coffee. The silver sedan that appeared with unusual frequency on my commute. The way my phone sometimes took slightly longer to perform simple tasks, as if something was running in the background. On Thursday, 3 days after receiving the email, I spotted him. A man in his 50s, unremarkable in appearance, taking photos of the park where I ate lunch. Not unusual behavior for a tourist, except he wasn't photographing the fountain or the architecture. He was capturing bench areas, angles that happened to include my usual spot. When our eyes met briefly, he didn't look away with the embarrassment of someone caught in an awkward moment. He held my gaze for 3 seconds, then deliberately turned and walked in the opposite direction. There was my confirmation. I was indeed under surveillance, professional enough that I would never have noticed without being tipped off. The question was, why had I been tipped off at all? The answer came that evening in the form of a second email from the same anonymous address. Ms. Morgan, I hope my previous message made an impression. I've been hired by your parents to monitor your activities and provide regular reports on your welfare. This arrangement has been ongoing for approximately 3 months. I am contacting you directly because I believe there are aspects to this situation that merit your awareness. If you wish to discuss this matter, I suggest the coffee shop on Gleason tomorrow at 10 a.m. Come alone and take a table near the east window. JD. Initials only, no company name, no credentials offered. It could be a trap, of course, or a scam. But what would the angle be? I had little of value to extort, and if this person had actually been hired by my parents, they already knew the basic parameters of my life. I forwarded this email to Lauren with a brief summary of the situation. Her response came within minutes, accompanied by 3 links to legal statutes and a strongly worded suggestion that I not meet with this individual under any circumstances. This is deeply concerning, Em, she wrote. PI work isn't illegal, but there are ethical boundaries. If your parents have hired someone to monitor you without your knowledge or consent, that's a violation of your privacy, though not necessarily a legal one depending on the methods used. Do not meet with this person alone. If you insist on following up, do it in a public place with someone you trust present, preferably a lawyer. Better yet, let me help you find a good attorney in Portland who can represent your interests. Her advice was sound, rational, and exactly what I would have given someone else in my position. But there was an element to this situation that transcended legal considerations. After 8 months of silence, this was the first tangible connection to my family. Not a caring one, certainly not a healthy one, but a confirmation that I hadn't simply been erased from the Morgan narrative. I wrote back to Lauren, promising to be careful, but not committing to avoiding the meeting. Then I sent a brief reply to JD confirming I would be at the suggested location, but with my own conditions. I would choose my own table. I would arrive early to survey the environment, and I reserved the right to leave immediately if anything felt wrong. The response came almost instantly. Reasonable precautions. I'll find you. That night, I researched every coffee shop on Gleason Street, eventually identifying the most likely location based on its layout and proximity to bus lines. I studied the floor plan visible in their Instagram posts, noting exits and seating arrangements. I located the east windows mentioned in the email, tables that would provide visibility while also allowing quick departure if necessary. I slept poorly, my dreams filled with shadowy figures taking notes on my movements, cameras hidden in everyday objects, my parents watching footage of my new life with clinical detachment. I woke before my alarm, feeling less rested than when I'd gone to bed. At precisely 9:30 a.m., I entered the coffee shop, ordered a double espresso I had no intention of drinking, and selected a table that offered a clear view of both the entrance and the street. I positioned myself with my back to the wall, placed my phone on the table with the camera activated to record, and waited. At 9:57, a man entered, not the one I had spotted in the park, but someone of similar age and equally nondescript appearance. Average height, average build, brown hair graying at the temples, clothing that would blend into any middle-class professional setting. The kind of person you would pass on the street a dozen times without retaining a single identifying detail. He ordered at the counter, then scanned the room until his gaze landed on me. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not surprise but confirmation. He approached with measured steps, coffee in hand. "Ms. Morgan," he said, his voice neither friendly nor hostile. "May I join you?" I gestured to the chair across from me, maintaining eye contact. "You have me at a disadvantage, JD." He smiled slightly as he sat. "James Dennison. I appreciate you agreeing to meet, though I understand your reservations." "Reservations is putting it mildly," I replied. "You've been spying on me for my parents." "I've been conducting surveillance at their request, yes." No denial, no euphemisms. "They engaged my services shortly after you relocated to Portland." "Why are you telling me this now? Isn't that contrary to your professional obligations?" Dennison took a sip of his coffee, considering his response. "My obligation is to provide the service contracted for in a legal and ethical manner. Your parents hired me to confirm your location, monitor your general welfare, and provide regular updates on your activities. They did not hire me to interfere with your life or to facilitate any action against you. Then why contact me at all?" He placed his cup down carefully. "Because circumstances have changed. Your parents initially presented this as concern for your well-being following a serious accident. That seemed reasonable, if somewhat intrusive. However, recent communications have indicated their intentions may be shifting in a direction I'm not comfortable with." "What direction?" "They've requested more detailed information about your financial situation, your employment contract, your medical records. They've asked about potential vulnerabilities in your current circumstances." He paused, watching my reaction. "I don't typically operate as a character in family dramas, Ms. Morgan. When clients begin using my services for purposes that cross certain lines, I prefer to disengage cleanly. I process this information, the implications crystallizing. They're looking for ways to force me back to Boston." Dennison didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. "Why tell me directly? Why not just terminate your contract with them?" "Professional courtesy," he replied, though something in his expression suggested there was more to it. "And perhaps a personal policy of not allowing my services to be used as weapons against people who appear to be simply living their lives." "How much have you told them already?" "That you're employed at a reputable design firm." that your physical recovery appears to be progressing well, that you've established a stable routine and social connections here in Portland. Basic information, visible to anyone who might observe you in public settings." He hesitated, then added, "I have not provided details about your medical appointments, your financial transactions, or private communications." Relief washed through me, tempered immediately by renewed concern. "If you refuse their expanded requests, they'll just hire someone else." "Likely," he agreed. "Someone with fewer ethical constraints." We sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since his first email. "Why did you really contact me, Mr. Dennison? This could have been accomplished with a simple anonymous tip. Why the meeting, the explanation, the warning?" Dennison studied me for a moment, his professional detachment slipping slightly. 20 years ago, I was hired to locate a young woman who had cut contact with her family. When I found her and saw the life she had built for herself, I realized the family relationship had been deeply problematic. I reported back as contracted, and 3 days later, the woman was forcibly returned to a situation she had fled at great personal cost. He paused, rotating his coffee cup slowly. "I've carried that outcome with me. I don't know your full history with your family, Ms. Morgan, but I recognize patterns. Sometimes distance isn't abandonment, it's survival." The words hit with unexpected force. I had never framed my departure from Boston as survival, had never allowed myself language that dramatic. But hearing it from this stranger, this professional, observer of human behavior, unlocked something I had been avoiding acknowledging. "What would you suggest I do with this information?" I asked. "Be aware, take precautions. Consider that your privacy has likely been compromised to some degree, and perhaps consult with a lawyer about establishing clear legal boundaries." He reached into his jacket and removed a small business card, sliding it across the table. "This is an attorney I've worked with in situations requiring discretion. She specializes in family law and privacy issues." I took the card, noting the Portland address. "And your involvement ends here?" "I'll be submitting my final report to your parents today, citing professional conflicts that prevent me from continuing the assignment. It will be factual, but limited to information already provided." He rose, buttoning his jacket with practiced precision. "What happens next is entirely your choice, Ms. Morgan." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "Mr. Dennison, why me? You must have dozens of clients with complicated family situations. Why break protocol in my case?" He paused, considering the question carefully. "Your resilience," he said. "Finally. Most people in your situation, cut off financially, recovering from serious injury, relocating across the country, would show signs of struggle. You've built something here, something worth protecting." With that, he walked out, moving with the same unremarkable efficiency that had allowed him to observe me undetected for months. I remained at the table, my untouched espresso growing cold, mind racing through implications and options. My phone buzzed, a text from Lauren. "Meeting over? Are you okay?" I wrote back, "Yes, need to talk, complicated." Within an hour, I was on a video call with Lauren, relaying the entire conversation. Her expression cycled through concern, outrage, and calculated analysis as I explained Dennison's warning about my parents' escalating requests. "This is serious, Em," she said when I finished. "If they're looking into your financial and medical information, they might be building a case that you're not capable of independent decision-making. Given your accident and the timing of your departure, they could potentially file for temporary guardianship on grounds of diminished capacity." "That's absurd," I protested. "I'm fully recovered, employed, completely self-sufficient." "You and I know that. But courts sometimes favor family members, especially those with resources and social standing like your parents. At minimum, you'd have to defend yourself against their claims, which means legal fees, time away from work, stress you don't need. So what do? Hide? Keep running? That's not a life, Lauren. She shook her head. Not running, protecting. There's a difference. She tapped her pen against her legal pad, thinking. First step is documentation. We need to establish your current mental and physical health officially. Medical evaluations, employment records, independent assessments if possible. And then? Then we consider a more proactive approach. Rather than waiting for them to make a move, we define the boundaries legally. Her expression hardened with determination. If your parents want to communicate with you, they can do it directly, not through hired surveillance. The next week passed in a blur of appointments and preparations. I followed Lauren's advice, consulting with the attorney Dennison had recommended, Catherine Zhao, a formidable woman whose office walls displayed diplomas from Harvard Law and photographs with various state Supreme Court justices. Your situation isn't uncommon, she told me during our initial consultation. Wealthy families often struggle with members who assert independence. The surveillance is concerning, but legally ambiguous. What's actionable is any attempt to access your private medical or financial records without consent. Under her guidance, I began assembling what she called a preemptive documentation package. My neurologist provided a comprehensive evaluation confirming my full cognitive recovery from the accident. My physical therapist documented my progress and current capabilities. My employer supplied a letter attesting to my professional performance and reliability. I provided financial records demonstrating my stability, regular income, manageable expenses, modest but consistent savings. I detailed the circumstances of my departure from Boston, my parents' refusal to assist with my recovery, and the 8 months of silence that followed. What exactly are we preparing for? I asked Catherine during our third meeting. Best case scenario? Nothing. Your parents recognize that further interference would be counterproductive and respect your independence. Her expression suggested this outcome was unlikely. Realistic scenario. They attempt some form of legal intervention, claiming concern for your welfare. With this documentation, we demonstrate immediately that such concerns are unfounded. And worst case? They escalate in ways we haven't anticipated. Family dynamics can be unpredictable, especially when control is the underlying issue. She closed my file decisively, which is why we're not just playing defense. Catherine's offensive strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than waiting for my parents to act, we would send a formal legal notice directly to them and to their primary attorney. The document would acknowledge their theoretical concerns for my welfare, provide evidence of my complete recovery and independence, and establish clear boundaries regarding future contact and surveillance. Will this stop them? I asked as I reviewed the final draft. It removes any pretense that their actions are motivated by legitimate concern, Catherine replied. It creates a record that you've addressed their stated worries while asserting your right to privacy. And it signals that you have legal representation prepared to defend those rights if necessary. The letter went out exactly 2 weeks after my meeting with Dennison, sent by certified mail to ensure delivery confirmation. 3 days later, Catherine received a response, not from my parents, but from their longtime family attorney, Howard Blankenship. The message was brief, professional, and revealing in its careful wording. Dear Ms. Zhao, I am in receipt of your letter dated May 17th regarding your client, Emma Morgan. I have conferred with Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, who wish to convey that their actions were motivated solely by concern following their daughter's serious accident and subsequent relocation. They had no intention of causing distress or invading Ms. Morgan's privacy. While they maintain that family matters are best resolved through direct communication rather than legal channels, they respect Ms. Morgan's desire for independence and will honor the boundaries outlined in your correspondence. They request that Ms. Morgan know they remain available should she wish to reestablish contact at her convenience. Sincerely, Howard Blankenship, Esca. Catherine forwarded the message. To me with a single comment. Interesting framing. They're retreating while attempting to maintain moral high ground. I read the response repeatedly, analyzing it as I would a structural drawing, looking for hidden flaws or subtle strengths. The language was careful, the concession clear but limited. There was no acknowledgement of their abandonment during my recovery, no explanation for the surveillance, no genuine apology for the invasion of privacy. Just a swift pivot to position themselves as reasonable parents respecting a headstrong daughter's wishes. It was exactly the Morgan approach to conflict resolution. Minimize, reframe, retreat temporarily while preserving the narrative that placed them in the right. I had seen this pattern throughout my childhood, my father's business setbacks, described as strategic realignments, my mother's social missteps recast as deliberate choices, Ryan's academic struggles attributed to teacher incompetence. Yet, beneath my cynicism about their response was an undeniable sense of relief. Whatever their private thoughts, they had agreed to back off. The immediate threat had passed. What now? I asked Catherine during our follow-up call. Now we wait. And watch, she replied. Continue your life as normal, but remain alert to any signs of renewed surveillance or interference. Document any contact attempts from your parents or individuals acting on their behalf. And remember that this letter establishes a legal framework we can build on if necessary. That evening, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself to fully process the events of the past 2 weeks. The discovery of surveillance had initially felt like a violation, a reminder that I couldn't truly escape my family's influence. But in responding, in taking direct action rather than simply reacting, I had reclaimed something essential. For the first time since the accident, I felt fully in control of my own narrative. Not because circumstances were perfect, or because all threats had been eliminated, but because I had faced a challenge directly and navigated it on my own terms. I opened my balcony door, letting the cool Portland evening air filter into the apartment. The city lights spread below, a constellation of possibilities I was still exploring. In Boston, I had always felt confined by expectations, hemmed in by the weight of the Morgan name and all it represented. Here, even under surveillance, I had felt more free than in my childhood home. My phone chimed with a text from Lauren. Any update from the Boston front? I typed back, official retreat, for now at least. Her response came quickly. Victory dance time? I smiled, considering the question. Was it a victory? Perhaps. But it felt less like winning a battle and more like establishing a border, defining the parameters of my independence clearly enough that even the Morgans, with all their resources and entitlement, had to acknowledge them. Not dancing yet, I replied, but standing firmly on my own ground. And that, I realized, was the true challenge my parents had never prepared me for. Not how to win conflicts or manipulate outcomes, but how to define and defend my own boundaries. How to recognize that my value wasn't determined by their approval or by adherence to their expectations, but by the life I chose to build, brick by deliberate brick, on foundation entirely my own. The letter from my lawyer to theirs wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a declaration of independence more meaningful than my physical departure from Boston had been. I had left in pain and silence, still carrying the weight of their abandonment. Now I was standing tall, speaking clearly, and defining the terms of our relationship moving forward. Whatever came next, reconciliation, continued estrangement, or something in between, would happen on my terms, not theirs. And that knowledge, more than any legal document or professional assurance, allowed me to sleep soundly that night for the first time since Dennison's email had arrived. The Morgan family estate looked exactly as I remembered it, a sprawling colonial revival set back from the road, shielded by century-old elm trees and immaculate hedgerows that required a full-time gardening staff to maintain. As the taxi approached the circular driveway, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the physical manifestation of the emotional armor I had always needed to enter this space. 3 months since receiving that warning email from James Dennison. 2 months since my lawyer's letter had supposedly established boundaries. 6 weeks since my parents had requested this meeting through formal channels. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss certain family matters in person, their message had read. No specifics, no emotional appeals, just a carefully worded invitation that acknowledged my legal representation while subtly suggesting that some issues transcended such formalities. I had deliberated for days, consulting with both Lauren and Catherine. Both had advised caution. If you go, Catherine had said, we establish clear parameters. Neutral location, defined time limit, your lawyer present if desired. But in the end, I had made a different choice. If this confrontation was inevitable, and it increasingly seemed that it was, I wanted it to happen on the battlefield I knew best. The Morgan estate, with all its oppressive perfection and unspoken rules, was territory I had navigated my entire life. I understood its pitfalls and pressure points in ways no lawyer or mediator could. You can drop me at the front entrance, I told the taxi driver as we approached the house. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, clearly trying to reconcile my simple attire with the grandeur of the destination. You sure? Looks like nobody's out front to meet you. I'm sure, I replied, appreciating his concern. This is my parents' home. His expression shifted to something like embarrassment. Sorry, miss. Didn't realize. No apology necessary. I handed him the fare plus a generous tip. Actually, could I ask a favor? If I haven't called for a pickup in exactly 2 hours, would you mind returning here anyway? He nodded, understanding dawning. Insurance policy. Smart. I'll be here at... He checked his watch. Exactly 3:15 p.m. Thank you. I stepped out of the car, straightening my jacket. A simple navy blazer over a white blouse and tailored trousers. Professional but not formal. Appropriate but not trying to impress. A deliberate choice, like everything about this visit. The taxi pulled away, leaving me alone at the base of the wide limestone steps. I took a deep breath, centering myself, before ascending. This wasn't a homecoming. This was a negotiation, and I needed to remember that every moment. Before I could reach for the ornate brass knocker, the heavy oak door swung open. Mrs. Winters, our longtime housekeeper, stood in the entryway, her expression an unreadable mixture of surprise and what might have been relief. Miss Emma, she said, her voice softer than I remembered. They're waiting in the library. No polite fiction that this was a casual family gathering then. Mrs. Winters had always been direct, one of the few people in this house who spoke plain truth, regardless of the Morgan preference for comfortable fictions. Thank you, I replied, stepping into the marble-floored foyer. It's good to see you, Mrs. Winters. She nodded, a slight smile appearing briefly. You're looking well. Portland agrees with you. I blinked, surprised by her knowledge of my location. You've been in contact with my parents about me? Not exactly. Her gaze shifted toward the library door, then back to me. Let's just say I notice things, including what mail comes for your father from certain types of agencies. The implications were clear. Mrs. Winters had been aware of the surveillance, had perhaps even seen reports about my new life. I felt a surge of something between gratitude and unease, wondering what else she might know about the family dynamics that had fractured so completely. The library, I repeated, nodding toward the closed door at the end of the hallway. Would you like me to bring tea? She offered, a small kindness that felt disproportionately meaningful. No, thank you. I don't plan to stay long. She nodded, once more, then retreated toward the kitchen, leaving me alone in the hushed grandeur of the foyer. The house smelled exactly as it always had. Lemon polish, fresh flowers, the subtle undertone of old money that somehow permeated the very walls. I allowed myself 5 seconds of stillness, a brief moment to acknowledge the childhood memories embedded in these spaces, before walking purposefully toward the library. I didn't knock. This performance of formality had gone on long enough. I turned the heavy brass handle and stepped inside, pulling the door firmly closed behind me. The library was my father's domain. 2 stories of leather-bound books, most unread but impressively curated by a professional bibliographer who updated the collection quarterly. A massive desk dominated one end of the room, positioned so that anyone approaching would feel like a supplicant before authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the meticulously maintained gardens, letting in afternoon light that seemed somehow cooler and less welcoming than the Portland sunshine I had grown accustomed to. My parents stood as I entered. My mother, rising from one of the leather wingbacks flanking the unlit fireplace, my father from his position behind the desk. Neither moved to greet me. Neither smiled. "Emma," my father said, his voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing. "Thank you for coming." I remained near the door, deliberately not approaching the seating area they had clearly arranged for this conversation. "You indicated there were matters requiring discussion," I replied, matching his formal tone. "I've allocated 1 hour." My mother's posture stiffened slightly at this declaration of limits. Surely there's no need for such rigid timeframes among family. 1 hour, I repeated, not acknowledging her attempt to reframe our relationship with that single word, family. "I have a flight back to Portland this evening." My father gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. "At least sit down, Emma. This isn't a business negotiation." "Isn't it?" I asked, but moved toward the indicated seating nonetheless. Remaining standing would only create unnecessary tension, and I needed to conserve my emotional energy for the actual substance of this conversation. I chose the chair opposite my mother, angling it slightly so I could maintain visual contact with both parents. My father, predictably, did not join us in the seating area, but remained standing, positioned between the fireplace and his desk, always the authority figure, never fully committing to equal footing in any conversation. "You're looking recovered," my mother offered, her gaze flicking over me assessingly. "The accident seems to have left no visible marks." "Physical therapy and time," I replied neutrally. "Modern medicine works wonders." "We were concerned when you disappeared," my father said, cutting through the pretense of small talk. "No communication, no forwarding address, just gone one day after a serious accident." I met his gaze directly. "Were you concerned or inconvenienced?" Because I recall quite clearly being told I would be shipped to Pine Lake to recover alone, despite medical advice that I needed regular assistance during initial recovery. "That's not," my mother began, but my father raised a hand, silencing her with the gesture that had controlled our family dynamics for decades. "We made arrangements we thought appropriate," he said stiffly. "If those arrangements didn't meet your expectations, there were more constructive ways to address the situation than simply vanishing." "Like what?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my tone. "A family discussion where my needs would be acknowledged and accommodated? Because that would have been unprecedented in this household." The words hung in the air, more direct than any I had ever spoken in this room. My mother's fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. My father's expression remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw, the subtle tell I had learned to recognize as a sign of suppressed anger. "You've become quite forthright in your time away," he observed. "I've become myself," I corrected, "without the constant pressure to be someone else." My mother sighed, a delicate sound practiced over decades of managing difficult social situations. "Emma, darling, we didn't ask you here to rehash old grievances. We're concerned about your current situation. Portland is so far away and after such a serious injury." "My current situation is excellent," I interrupted, unwilling to let her re-establish the patronizing dynamic that had defined our relationship. "I have a fulfilling position at a respected architecture firm." I've fully recovered from my injuries. I have friends, colleagues, a life I've built independently. A life we know very little about, my father interjected, because you've chosen complete estrangement. I allowed myself a small, composed smile. Do you really know so little? Or should we discuss the private investigator you hired to monitor my activities in Portland? The silence that followed was profound. My mother's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. Not at the surveillance itself, I realized, but at my knowledge of it. My father's expression remained controlled, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. We were worried, he said finally. You had suffered a traumatic brain injury. You had disappeared without warning. As your parents, we had a responsibility to ensure you were safe. Safe, I repeated, letting the word hang between us. So safe that when your investigator reported I was doing well, employed, recovered, stable, you instructed him to dig deeper, to look for vulnerabilities in my new life, to access medical and financial records that might provide leverage. My mother turned to my father, confusion evident in her expression. This, apparently, had not been shared with her. Interesting. Thomas? She questioned softly. My father straightened, authority reasserting itself in his bearing. Emma clearly has a flair for dramatic interpretation. We simply asked for comprehensive information to assess her welfare. Mr. Dennison was quite specific about your requests, I countered calmly. Specific enough that he chose to terminate your contract rather than comply with directives he found ethically questionable. You've spoken with Dennison. Not a question from my father, but a recalibration. New information requiring adjusted strategy. He felt a professional obligation to warn me that your intentions had shifted from monitoring to intervention. I leaned forward slightly. What exactly were you planning, Dad? A legal claim of diminished capacity? Financial pressure through the trust grandfather established? Or something more direct? The directness of the question, the use of Dad, rather than father, the explicit naming of strategies that would normally remain tactfully unmentioned in Morgan communications, visibly unsettled him. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, I had seized control of the conversation, had forced reality into spaces usually occupied by carefully constructed fictions. We wanted options, he admitted finally, the closest to honesty I had heard from him in years. If you were truly in trouble, truly making decisions impaired by your injury, we needed to be prepared to help, even if that help wasn't initially welcome. And who would determine if I was truly in trouble? You? From 3,000 miles away, based on surveillance reports and your own preconceptions about what my life should look like. My mother interjected, her voice taking on the soothing tone she had always used when family tensions threatened to disrupt the appearance of harmony. Emma, try to understand. When children make dramatic life changes after traumatic events, parents naturally worry about impulsivity, about decisions made from emotional distress rather than clear thinking. I'm 28 years old, I reminded her. A professional with an established career, a fully functioning adult by any measure. And yet you speak of me as if I were a teenager making rash decisions. Age doesn't preclude poor judgment, my father countered, particularly following brain injury. I smiled again, this time with genuine amusement. How convenient that medical concerns arise only when my choices don't align with your expectations. Tell me, were you equally worried about neurological impairment when I was working 60-hour weeks at my Boston firm? Or did concerns about my cognitive functioning only emerge when I chose independence over compliance? My mother flinched at the bluntness of the question. My father's expression hardened. You're twisting our intentions, he said flatly. Am I? Or am I simply refusing to accept the sanitized version of events that this family has always specialized in? I maintained steady eye contact. Let's be completely honest for once. You abandoned me when I needed support most. When that didn't bring me back under your influence, you resorted to surveillance. When surveillance revealed I was succeeding independently, you began looking for ways to undermine that independence. Those aren't the actions of concerned parents. They're the actions of people accustomed to control who can't accept its loss. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. My mother looked away, fingers nervously straightening a brooch that needed no adjustment. My father remained still, his expression unreadable except for the slight tightening around his eyes that had always signaled internal calculation. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted subtly, less authoritative, more measured. What do you want from this meeting, Emma? Clearly you didn't come for reconciliation. A fair question, perhaps the first genuine inquiry he had made since my arrival. I considered it carefully before responding. I want clarity, I said finally. I want acknowledgement of reality rather than comfortable fictions. I want established boundaries that will be respected moving forward. Boundaries, my mother repeated, the word foreign in her mouth. Like those outlined in your lawyer's letter? Yes, but more than legal parameters. I want understanding that my life is my own to direct, that my choices aren't subject to your approval or intervention, that any relationship between us moving forward will be between equals, not authority figures and a subordinate. My father made a dismissive gesture. Parent-child relationships are inherently unequal, Emma. That's the natural order. Between parents and minor children, perhaps. Not between parents and adult offspring. Not in healthy relationships, at least. The implication hung in the air that our relationship had never been healthy, that the dynamics established in my childhood were fundamentally flawed. My mother's expression shifted between discomfort and something that might have been genuine. Reflection. My father remained impassive, but I could almost see the mental adjustments happening behind his carefully controlled facade. And if we can't provide the type of relationship you're demanding? He asked finally. Then we won't have one, I replied simply. I didn't come here seeking emotional validation or approval, Dad. I came because ignoring this situation entirely wasn't resolving it. You've demonstrated that you'll take action regardless of my silence. So I'm being explicit about my terms for any future contact. My mother made a small sound, something between a sigh and a protest. Surely it needn't be so absolute, Emma. Families find ways to accommodate differences. The Morgan family has never accommodated differences, I corrected gently. It has demanded conformity and punished deviation. I lived within that system for 28 years. I won't return to it, not even in a modified form. So you're presenting ultimatums, my father said, an edge entering his voice. I'm establishing boundaries, I repeated. You're free to accept or reject them. But understand that rejection means continuing estrangement, not negotiation for more favorable terms. The directness of this statement, the complete absence of the hedging, placating language I had always employed in family discussions, seemed to finally penetrate my father's certainty. He studied me with new attention, as if seeing not the daughter he had always presumed to know, but a fully formed person who had developed beyond his careful planning. You've changed, he said finally. I've become myself, I corrected again. There's a difference. My mother leaned forward slightly. What exactly are these boundaries you're requiring, Emma, in practical terms? A reasonable question. The first indication that she might actually be engaging with reality rather than the familiar patterns of emotional manipulation. I had come prepared for this, had rehearsed these points during the flight east. First, no surveillance or investigation of any kind. No private detectives, no digital monitoring, no financial tracking. I maintained eye contact, first with her, then shifting to my father. Second, no contact with my employer, colleagues, medical providers or friends without my explicit permission. Third, No attempts to exercise control through financial leverage, including any family trusts or inheritances. My father's expression tightened at this last point. Financial control had always been his primary method of maintaining family discipline. "And if these boundaries are respected?" he asked. "What then?" "Then we can begin limited direct communication, emails, occasional phone calls, potentially in-person meetings in neutral locations after sufficient trust has been rebuilt." I kept my tone even, matter of fact. "But that rebuilding starts from this moment, not from some imagined past where our relationship was healthier than it actually was." My mother nodded slowly. Whether in agreement or simply acknowledgement of my position, I couldn't tell. My father remained still, his expression giving nothing away. The silence stretched between us, heavy with decades of unspoken truths and carefully maintained fictions. Finally, my father moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed a manila folder. So similar to the one that had featured in my nightmares since the accident that I felt a momentary chill. "We assumed this conversation might occur eventually," he said, approaching with the folder in hand. "Though perhaps not quite so. Directly." He placed the folder on the small table between the chairs, not offering it to me but positioning it where I could easily take it. "Financial and legal documents regarding your position in the family estate, trusts, and business interests. We had these prepared after receiving your lawyer's letter." I didn't reach for the folder. "I'm not here for financial negotiations." "Not negotiations," he corrected. "Information. Regardless of our personal relationship, you have legal interests in family holdings that require documentation. Catherine Zhao can review these materials to confirm their legitimacy." The mention of my lawyer by name, the acknowledgement of my independent legal representation, was significant. A small concession, perhaps, but a meaningful one from a man who rarely yielded ground in any confrontation. I nodded once, taking the folder but not opening it. "I'll have Catherine review these documents." "There's one other matter," my mother said, her voice carefully controlled. She glanced at my father, who gave a slight nod of permission. "Your grandfather has been asking about you. He's aware of your departure, though not the specifics of why or how. His health has been declining, and he's expressed a wish to see you." My grandfather, my father's father, not the maternal grandfather who had established my trust. The family patriarch, 87 years old and still the ultimate authority in the Morgan hierarchy. The man whose approval my father had spent his life pursuing, whose standards had shaped the impossible expectations that had defined my childhood. "Is he here? In the house?" I asked, suddenly understanding why this meeting had been requested at the estate rather than a neutral location. My mother nodded. "He moved in last month. The stairs at his place became too difficult." I processed this information, weighing obligations and boundaries, past hurts and potential regrets. My relationship with my paternal grandfather had always been complex. He had been demanding but occasionally kind, rigidly traditional, yet sometimes surprisingly progressive in unexpected areas. Unlike my parents, he had actually seemed interested in my architectural pursuits, even if he viewed them as charming hobbies rather than serious professional ambitions. "I'll see him before I leave," I decided. Briefly. Relief flickered across my mother's face. My father's expression remained neutral. But the slight relaxation in his shoulders suggested this concession mattered more than he would acknowledge. "He's in the sunroom," my mother said, rising from her chair with careful grace. "I'll let him know you're here." As she left the library, my father and I remained in charged silence. We had said most of what needed saying, had established positions that would either form the foundation of a new, more honest relationship or mark the final boundaries of a permanent estrangement. Without my mother's mediating presence, the weight of this reality seemed to settle more fully in the room. "You really won't come back to Boston," he said finally, a statement rather than a question. "No," I confirmed. "My life is in Portland, now." He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Your mother finds that difficult to accept. And you? He considered the question with unusual care. I find it unexpected. The Morgan family has remained geographically connected for generations. Perhaps that's part of the problem, I suggested quietly. Too much proximity, too little perspective. Something shifted in his expression then. Not agreement exactly, but a moment of genuine consideration rather than automatic dismissal. You always did see things differently, he acknowledged, even as a child. Your grandfather called it the architect's eye, attention to aspects of structures others overlook. The comment surprised me, both the observation itself and the fact that my grandfather had noticed this quality in me long before I had formally pursued architecture. Before I could respond, the library door opened and my mother returned. He's ready to see you, she said. He's having a good day, quite lucid. I rose, gathering my bag and the folder of documents. I'll go alone, I said, making it clear. This wasn't a request for permission. My mother hesitated, then nodded. Of course, the sunroom is… I remember where it is, I interrupted gently. I turned to my father, our unfinished conversation hanging between us. I'll consider what you've said, both what was spoken and what wasn't. He held my gaze for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly, not quite a nod, but an acknowledgement, of sorts. The taxi you arranged will be waiting at the front entrance when you're finished. Of course he knew about my transportation arrangements. Some habits of control were too ingrained to break immediately, but there was something almost respectful in his tone, an acceptance of my preparation and foresight rather than an attempt to override them. I left the library without further comment, walking the familiar hallway toward the sunroom at the eastern end of the house. Each step felt strangely significant, as if I were navigating not just physical space, but the complex geography of family history and personal identity. The Morgan estate had always been more than a house to me. It had been the physical manifestation of expectations I could never quite fulfill, of traditions I could never comfortably inhabit. Now, moving through it with the confidence of someone who had built a life beyond its walls, I saw it differently. Not as an intimidating fortress of family legacy, but simply as a house. Impressive but imperfect, historically significant but ultimately just a structure. Important only to the degree that its inhabitants made it so. The sunroom door stood ajar, afternoon light spilling through the wall of windows that overlooked the most elegant portion of the gardens. I paused at the threshold, taking a deep breath before gently knocking on the doorframe. Grandfather, I said quietly. It's Emma. He turned from his position by the windows, a thin figure in an expensive wheelchair, still immaculately dressed in a tailored shirt and cashmere sweater despite his physical decline. His eyes, the same sharp gray as my father's as my own, found mine immediately, alert and assessing. There you are, he said, his voice frailer than I remembered, but still carrying the authoritative tone that had commanded boardrooms for decades. Come in, girl. Let me see what the West Coast has done to you. I stepped into the sunroom, allowing the door to close softly behind me. The confrontation with my parents had been necessary, perhaps even cathartic, but this conversation, with the man who had shaped the family dynamics I was now fighting to redefine, might prove to be the true test of my newfound independence. As I moved toward him, his expression shifted from assessment to something more complex, a mixture of recognition and surprise, as if he were seeing not just the granddaughter who had left, but someone both familiar and unexpectedly new. Well, he said simply, there you are indeed. My new apartment in Portland has 12-foot ceilings and windows that capture the afternoon light in a way that transforms the space entirely. I chose it specifically for this quality, the way sunshine moves through the rooms like a living thing, touching surfaces, creating warmth, changing perspective hour by hour. It's the kind of architectural element that can't be manufactured, only recognized and honored through thoughtful design. I'm sitting at my drafting table, an antique oak piece I found at an estate sale and restored myself, sketching preliminary concepts for a community arts center. Westridge Design has trusted me with my first solo project, a renovation that will transform an abandoned warehouse into a multi-use creative space. 6 months ago, I was still fighting for the right to make decisions about my own recovery. Now, I'm designing spaces that will shape how entire communities interact with art and each other. The irony doesn't escape me. My phone buzzes gently against the table's surface. Lauren's name appears on the screen, accompanied by her latest professional headshot. Severe black blazer, confident smile, the New York skyline visible through the window behind her. I smile and answer on speaker, continuing to sketch as we talk. "Let me guess," she says without preamble. "You're working on a Saturday again." "It's not work when you love it," I counter, an old exchange between us. "Tell that to my billable hours." I can hear her smile through the phone. "Any update from the Boston front?" I set down my pencil, giving the conversation my full attention. Grandfather's funeral was last Tuesday. I flew in for the service, flew out the same day. And the family dynamics? Surprisingly civil. Dad actually asked questions about my project. Mom mentioned visiting Portland someday soon, though I suspect that's just something people say at funerals. And Ryan congratulated me on the promotion, seemed genuinely happy for me, in his Ryan way. "Progress," Lauren observes. "Slow, imperfect progress." That's the perfect description for what's happened in the 6 months since my confrontation at the Morgan estate. My boundaries remain firmly in place, but small channels of communication have opened. Brief emails from my mother about inconsequential matters. The occasional business article forwarded by my father with minimal commentary. Nothing profound, nothing that approaches real emotional intimacy, but contact nonetheless. My grandfather's death 3 weeks ago brought its own complex recalibration. Our conversation in the sunroom that day, his unexpectedly candid observations about family dynamics, his acknowledgement of my architectural talent, his admission that perhaps the Morgans have always confused control with care, had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of our family history. Not enough to erase decades of emotional distance, but enough to create space for questions rather than just certainty. "The lawyer called," I tell Lauren, returning to our conversation. "The will reading is scheduled for next month. Are you going back for that?" I consider the question, turning my pencil between my fingers. "Catherine says I don't need to be there in person. She can represent my interests." But I think I should go. Not because I care about the inheritance, but because avoiding difficult situations isn't the same as being free of them. Lauren is quiet for a moment, the silence comfortable between us. "You've changed," she says finally. "Evolved," I correct with a smile. "There's a difference." After we hang up, I return to my sketching, but my mind remains on the journey of the past year. From the accident that shattered more than bones, to the painful recognition of my parents. Abandonment. From the desperate rebuilding of a life 3,000 miles away to the discovery of surveillance. From confrontation to boundaries, to this new tenuous equilibrium where relationship doesn't require submission. I think about my grandfather often since his death, not just our final conversation, but what he represented in our family mythology. He was the original architect of the Morgan approach to life, structured, controlled, defined by specific expectations and measurements of success. Yet in our last interaction, he had looked at me with unexpected recognition. "You got out," he had said, reaching for my hand with fingers that felt like paper. "Good for you, Emma. Someone finally got out." I hadn't understood his meaning fully then. Now, reflecting on his journey, from working-class roots to immense success, From financial security to the gilded cage of social expectations. I wonder if he had built a structure even he couldn't find the exit from. My phone buzzes again. A text from Elaine. Client loves your preliminary sketches. Green light to move forward with development phase. Drinks to celebrate? I smile, typing back a quick acceptance. This is what freedom looks like for me. Meaningful work, chosen relationships, the ability to define success on my own terms. A letter arrived from my mother yesterday. Not an email, but an actual handwritten note on the heavy cream stationery she's used for decades. Inside was a newspaper clipping about my art center project, published in a small Portland weekly. She had underlined my name and written in the margin, "Your grandfather would have been proud. Perhaps I am learning to be as well." Not an apology. Not a complete reconciliation, but an acknowledgement, however small, however belated, of my right to choose my own path. I place the letter in the box where I keep important correspondence, next to the final report from my physical therapist, complete recovery exceeding initial projections, and the formal notification from Catherine that all surveillance activities have ceased and been legally barred from resumption. The afternoon light is shifting now, casting longer shadows across my workspace. Soon it will be time to change for drinks with colleagues, to step out into the Portland evening with its gentle energy so different from Boston's driving pace. But for now, I allow myself a moment of quiet recognition. I am Emma Morgan, architect, survivor, builder of spaces and boundaries, not defined by what happened to me, but by what I chose to create afterward. Outside my window, the city continues. Its Saturday rhythms, people walking dogs, couples holding hands, food trucks serving early dinner to weekend crowds. I watch them from my elevated perspective, not separate from life, but momentarily observant of its patterns and flows. This too is an architect's skill, seeing both details and the larger design they create together. My phone buzzes one more time. A text from an unknown Boston number. It's Ryan. New phone. Mom mentioned you're not coming for the will reading. Dinner when you're here? Just us. No agenda. I consider the invitation, weighing history against possibility. There was a time when any contact from my family would have triggered immediate anxiety, the instinctive response of someone conditioned to expect judgment with every interaction. Now I feel curiosity instead. What might a relationship with my brother look like if built on mutual respect rather than competition and comparison? We'll be in town May 15th, 17, I reply. Dinner works. You choose the place. His response comes quickly. Great, I'll make reservations. And Emma, I'm glad you're coming. I set the phone down and return to my sketches, adding detail to a community, garden space that will occupy what was once a loading dock. Transformation is rarely simple or complete. Old structures influence new designs, whether we acknowledge them or not. The trick is recognizing which elements to preserve for their strength, and which to replace for a more sustainable future. The afternoon light touches my drafting table now, illuminating the plans taking shape beneath my hands. Not perfect yet, but promising. A work in progress, evolving with intention and care. Like me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.